This week I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts, one that I listen to on a regular basis. And on this podcast, they were interviewing a guy named Carlos Whitaker. And Carlos at one time was a Christian recording artist. He was a worship leader at one of the biggest churches here in the United States. And in this interview, he tells about this time in his life and what he went through. And it was a time where he got caught up and really addicted to porn, and that led to him breaking up with his wife and entering into an affair. And he talks about the fact that through all that time, the one thing that kept coming to mind was, is God going to ever be able to use me again? I mean, because of what I've been through, will God be able to use me ever again? And that was really on his mind. And I think, frankly, for a lot of us, that we're in the same boat. Maybe we haven't done the exact same things that he did. But when we sin, when we go off the rails, when we get far away from God, I think we all sometimes feel like, can God ever use me again? Let me ask you a couple of questions. Have you ever committed murder? Have you ever committed sexual sin like Carlos Whitaker did? You know, if we use the definitions that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount, probably all of us are guilty of those things, right? He said, if you hate your brother, it's the same as murder. He said, if you look lustfully at someone else, that's committing sexual sin. And yet, I'm convinced that even if we've done those things, God can still use us. I mean, think about David. David did that, didn't he? David murdered. David committed sexual immorality. And God still used him. Not only used him, he says that David was a man after his own heart. And so what I want you to understand this morning, that no matter what you've been through, no matter what sin that you might have committed, that God can still use you. As a matter of fact, here's the big idea that we want to take away from the passage that we're going to look at this morning, and that is this, that God uses flawed people to accomplish His flawless purposes. That's what God does in our life. He uses flawed people like us to accomplish His purposes. God is flawless. We're not, and yet God can still use us. He can use people like Carlos Whitaker, and He can use people like you and like me to carry out His purposes. We left off in our journey through the Old Testament. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the prayer of Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. And you'll remember that when we looked at that Daniel understood from the prophet Jeremiah that the exile of the people of Judah, the Jews, it was about to end. And so Daniel prays this prayer on behalf of his people because he understood that they weren't ready to go back to their land. Now this morning we're going to see that they eventually do go back to Judah, at least a lot of them. But one of the things we find, and you've probably figured this out by now, is that the Old Testament is not necessarily written in chronological order. I mean, think about when we first began this whole journey through the Old Testament, we looked at the story of Job when we were looking at Genesis, because that's chronologically when the account of Job happened. And we're going to see the same thing really over the next few weeks, because we're going to go from Daniel, where we were a couple of weeks ago, we're going to go backwards to the book of Esther this morning. Then we're going to go back next week, even before that, at least the way the books are arranged in your Bible, to Ezra and to Nehemiah. And so our Bibles are not necessarily arranged chronologically. So let me give you kind of an overview of what happens here to put all this into perspective, because I think it's going to be really important for us to understand that. After the exile ended, the first group of Israelites, the first group of Jews, go back to Judah, about 50,000 of them, under the direction of a guy named Zerubbabel. And they do that in 536 BC. And they go back, and the primary thing that they do is they begin to rebuild the temple. And that's all recorded for us in our Bibles in Ezra chapter 1 through 6. That's kind of the account of this first group of 50,000 people that goes back. And then we find that during this time that a new king comes on the scene in Persia. It's a guy named Xerxes, who's also known as Ahasuerus, as we'll see this morning as we look at the passage. And during his reign, Esther becomes queen. We're going to look at that a little bit this morning. And the book of Esther really records the events that take place here between the first and the second return. And what we're going to find is that the influence that Esther had there in the Persian court really made it possible for the second and the third returns to happen. The second return actually happens, as you see here, in about 457 BC. It's led by Ezra, who's a scribe and a priest. And next week, we're going to actually look at a passage in Ezra chapter 7. And the primary purpose here was for Ezra to go back and to teach the people. He brings only about another 2,000 people with him. So it's actually a very small group that come back with Ezra. And then finally, the last return happens under Nehemiah. And that happens in 444 BC. And the primary purpose then, as we've looked at before, is to come back and to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. And that's all obviously recorded for us in the book of Nehemiah. That kind of makes sense. So that'll kind of help you to put all these things into context chronologically this morning. You know, when I read the book of Esther again this week, it's a really intriguing book. It reads more like a plot for a TV movie or something. I mean, there's intrigue here. There's politicians who abuse women so that they can stay in power. There's deception. There's lying. There's heroes, and there's a great villain in here. We even find that an underdog comes along and overcomes all the odds. And so really that's what we find in the book of Esther. And I encourage you, if you haven't read it in a while, take some time and go back and read the whole book, because it's a really interesting story. And we're only going to have time to just kind of touch the surface of it this morning. It's really easy to read the book of Esther and to come away with this idea that the two heroes in the story are Mordecai and Esther. But the more I read through it this week, the more I began to see what some other commentators have kind of suggested, that maybe Mordecai and Esther are not the kind of godly, faithful people that we often think that they are. Because we tend to, I think, look at some of the heroes of the Bible through rose-colored glasses sometimes, and we tend to see all the good stuff, and we don't tend to see some of their flaws sometimes. We want to make them out to kind of be bigger than life. I was reading one commentator this week, a guy named Bob Deffenbaugh, and he said this about the book about Esther. He says, "And Esther and Mordecai are just one more example of reading the Bible through rose-colored glasses, seeing people in a way that make us feel comfortable." As you read the book, you cannot help but come away with the idea that the real hero in the book is not even mentioned once in the entire book. You know who the hero is? The hero here is God. And this, along with one other book in the Bible, are the only books that we have where the name of God is not mentioned even once in the entire book. There, you go back and read it. Not mentioned there at all. And I think that's instructive. I think it's sometimes what's not in the text can be just as important as what is in the text. And I think this morning, hopefully I can help to demonstrate why I think that's true. But God is definitely the hero here. Every step of the way, you see God working behind the scene to bring about the salvation of His people, and to bring about Him keeping the promises that He's made all the way back to Abraham and David and all the others that we've seen as we've gone through this journey. So the hero of the story here is God, even though He's not mentioned at all. And I think that'll become really apparent this morning. Let me give you a little bit of background of the book before we're going to look at chapter 4 in just a minute of the book of Esther, so you might want to go ahead and turn to there. But the book of Esther begins with this description of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, who's also known as Xerxes. And this kingdom is widespread. It tells us it goes all the way from Ethiopia to India here. It's a huge, giant empire that the Persians now rule over. And King Ahasuerus, he's this great leader, and he convenes a 6-month-long military planning meeting. And they're going to map out this strategy because he wants to go and he wants to attack Greece. And so they plan the whole thing out, and they get to the end of this 6-month meeting, and he decides that he's going to have a big party for all the men in the city of Susa. So they all get together and they have this grand party. And it says in chapter 1, it says the wine was really flowing there. And you can imagine by the end of 7 days, these guys are hanging around. They've been partying. They're all pretty drunk. And King Ahasuerus, he commands his queen, Queen Vashti, to come and basically to parade before the men for their pleasure. And Queen Vashti, to her credit, she's like, I'm not gonna give up my integrity to go and do that. So she refuses to come before the king and all these other men. And the king gets enraged. He's not very happy with that. He says, man, if word gets out that my queen disobeyed me, just think of what all the other women are going to do. He says, we can't have that. So he gets rid of the queen. He makes this decree that she can't ever even come back into the palace again. About 4 years later now, when we pick up in chapter 2, Ahasuerus is gone. He tried to attack Greece. It wasn't very successful, so he comes back to Persia and he says, I think it's about time to pick another queen. So they have a Miss Persia contest. And all these women come through and they parade before the king. And of all the people that were there, he ends up picking this young Jewish girl named Esther to become his next queen. Something that nobody could have ever predicted. Nobody could ever have imagined that someone like her could become queen. And yet she does that because I believe that God is working behind the scenes. But there's something interesting that happens here. She's been raised all along by an older cousin named Mordecai. And Mordecai keeps telling Esther, he says, don't let them know you're a Jew. Don't let them know you're a Jew. So she kind of lives as this undercover Jew there as the new queen, and nobody really knows of her Jewish descent. Now, that really kind of flies in the face, doesn't it, of what God calls us to do when we belong to Him. We're not to live today as undercover Christians. We're to live openly for Christ. And the Jews were to live openly for God too. They were to be a testimony of His greatness. And yet, so we already begin to see some clues here that maybe Mordecai and maybe Esther are not quite as godly, maybe not quite as faithful to God as sometimes we portray them to be. After Esther becomes queen, a guy named Haman comes to power. He becomes the prime minister. He's second in power only to the king. And he requires that everyone bow down before him. We've seen instances of that before in the Scriptures, haven't we? Like in the book of Daniel. And Mordecai says, no, I'm not going to do that. So Haman gets really angry at Mordecai. But he says, I'm not going to just take out my vengeance on Mordecai. I'm going to take it out on the entire Jewish people. And so he basically tricks the king into issuing this decree that says, on a certain day, 1 year from now, all the Jews in the entire empire and the entire kingdom are going to be wiped out and killed. Man, woman, and child. And he actually gets the king's signet ring so he can seal this, which means that nobody can change that decree that he's put out there. So with that in mind, with that background in mind, we're now ready to pick up in Esther chapter 4. So let me begin reading there. It says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Mordecai, he learns of what's going on. He finds out about the decree that the king has issued. And he puts on sackcloth. And he's in mourning, which is a picture of mourning there. And he goes out and he goes up to the king's gate. But he can't go into the king's palace because the king doesn't want anybody sad in his palace. He doesn't want anyone that's mourning there. So he had a rule. If you're wearing sackcloth, you can't come into the palace. And it tells us that the rest of the Jews who are scattered all throughout the kingdom, that they too began to learn about this decree. And so they put on sackcloth. They go into mourning and they're weeping over this decree that's been made. Pick up in verse 4. It says, when Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servant and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. So Esther learns what Mordecai's doing. She sends him out some new clothes, and he says, oh, no, I'm not putting on the new clothes. Here's what's happening. You need to go in, and you need to talk to the king, because that's the only way that all of us Jews are going to be saved. And Esther sends back word to Mordecai and says, look, Mordecai, you know the rules. You know what this king is like. You know what his temper is like. If I go into him when I haven't been called in there and he doesn't extend that golden scepter to me, I'm going to die. He's going to kill me. He's not going to just get rid of me like Queen Vashti. He's going to kill me. And so Esther is really reluctant to do what Mordecai has asked her to do here. Let's finish the chapter here. It says, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days or night. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him to do. You know, there's really two ways to kind of look at this section. On one hand, we could look at it and we could say that Mordecai and Esther are being really faithful to God here. That they're putting their faith and their trust in God. And that's the way most commentators, I think, tend to approach this passage. That's the way that I've always looked at this passage in the past. And so if that's the case, when you get to verse 14 there, and Mordecai says that God is going to provide salvation from another place, you have to assume that when he says from another place, he's speaking about God, even though he never uses the name of God there. He never says God's going to provide salvation. He just says salvation will come from another place. And in some other way, God's going to provide salvation. And when Esther says, if I perish, I perish, if you assume that she's being faithful to God, you assume what she means is kind of like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, when they said, hey, we're going to just do whatever God says and we will accept the consequences. If he rescues us, fine. If not, fine. We're going to look at that just a moment and kind of compare it to what Esther says here. So that's really the way I think that most people take this passage here. But as I read back through it again this week, and I read actually through the whole book again to kind of put this into context, I'm not sure here that the author isn't actually trying to show us exactly the opposite, that there's a lack of trust here on the part of both Mordecai and Esther. And frankly, if we look at the passage in that way, it really fits in more, doesn't it, with our main theme today, which is that a flawless God often uses flawless people to carry out his purposes. And I think in a lot of ways we're going to see here that Mordecai and Esther, that they are deeply flawed people. Now, if all we had to go on was the fact that God is never mentioned, that Mordecai never mentions God, that Esther never mentions God, I would agree. That's a pretty weak case. That would be kind of speaking from what's not in the text. I think that's important, what's not in the text, but if that's all we had, I'd say, man, maybe they're still really faithful. But here's where I run into a problem with that approach. It's verses 13 and 14. If you look at those verses together, here's what Mordecai is essentially saying to Esther. He says to her, look, if you don't go in and speak to the king, all the Jews are going to die. And don't think that you're going to not perish with them. You're going to die just like them too. They're going to find out who you are and you're going to die. But then in verse 14, he seems to say, well, even if you're silent, God's going to come rescue you anyway. So which is it? Are they all going to die, or is God going to come rescue them? And he even says in verse 14, well, if God provides another way of salvation, if God provides another way of rescue, guess what? You're going to die, you and your family anyway. Now, how do you think Esther felt about that? If she goes and speaks to the king, she's probably going to die there because she's not supposed to go into the king. But if she doesn't, the Jews are all going to die, or maybe they're all going to live, but either way, she's going to die. I mean, that's essentially what those verses are saying there. So that puts her in a pretty tough position, doesn't it? But what if instead of a statement in chapter 14 or verse 14, that verse 14 was a question? The underlying Greek actually, or Hebrew, actually allows that this could be a question. Kind of a rhetorical question, something that would be worded something like this. Do you really think that if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place? Dave, I think you need to be ahead one more slide there. One more, I think, Dave. There we go. I think that's the essence. That's what he's saying to her here. And that really makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? If you think about it that way, because then what he's saying to Esther, he's really trying to manipulate her into going to the king, because he's saying to her, look, if you don't go into the king, we're all going to die and you're going to die with them. And do you really think that if you don't do that, that somehow God's going to bring relief from somewhere else? So what he's really saying to her is that if you don't act, Esther, we're all dead. You know, we all know about in football, about the Hail Mary. Well, for the Jews, this was the Hail Esther. You know, what he's really saying is if you don't go do this, I know it's a long shot, but if you don't go do this, there's just no other way that God's going to save us. I think that's really the essence of what Mordecai is saying here. That, if you take it in a whole context here, that seems to make more sense. And therefore, when Esther says, if I perish, I perish, I think that's a lot more fatalistic than what it sounds. I'm not sure that it's real faithful at all. I think she's just saying, well, que sera, sera, you know, if you want to put it in other terms. Whatever happens, happens. She's just like, I'll go ahead and do it, but you know, whatever happens, happens. I mean, think about what she says. If I perish, I perish. That sounds kind of good, but listen to what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said in Daniel chapter 3, and see if you don't see a difference here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you've set up. Do you see the difference there? I mean, they specifically say, look, we trust God. We trust that what God will do. And if he saves us, that's great. If he chooses not to save us, we're going to serve him anyway. That's a whole lot different than if I perish, I perish. At least it seems to me as I look at this. But here's the thing. Whether this passage is trying to show that Mordecai and Esther are faithful or whether they're faithless, I think there's some things that we can learn, anything that really are going to be applicable either way. Before I show you those things, though, let me just mention one more thing here in the text. Look in verse 3 and in verse 16. In verse 3, it says, all the people fasted. And then when it gets to verse 16, it talks about the fact that that Esther calls for a fast among the people too. And when I read that, I kind of like just automatically put fast and pray in there. But do you notice what's missing there? The word pray is not in there at all. And I think we've been accustomed, because there are so many places in the Scripture where fasting and praying are linked together, that I think we just read that and we automatically assume that's what the fasting was for there. But it doesn't say praying. Matter of fact, it doesn't talk about praying anywhere in the entire book of Esther again. It's just not in there. And if you go back and you look in the Scriptures, you're going to find that there are a lot of other places in the Scripture where fasting takes place that is not accompanied by prayer. And most of those instances that you'll find, they're almost always associated with somebody dying. And that when somebody dies, there's a fast that takes place as part of the mourning process. And that seems to make sense here, because it talks about them what? Fasting and mourning and weeping. And I think what's going on here is the fact that what Esther's really saying is like, let's have a fast because I'm going to die anyway. So let's go ahead and mourn because I'm going to die. And that really seems to make sense, because who else does she say is going to go ahead and fast right along with her? She says, my servants are going to fast right along with me. Her servants were not Jews. They didn't even know she was a Jew up to this point because she's hidden it. And so I don't think she's calling on them to make some kind of a religious observance here. So when I look at all that, it seems to me like the passage and the book are really tending to kind of emphasize the fact that Esther and Mordecai really weren't all that faithful, but that God used them anyway. But even if they are faithful, they sure weren't totally faithful, were they? I mean, you don't go around hiding the fact that you're a Jew and say that you're faithful to God. So here's some important truths. Whether this, like I say, whether it's showing they're faithful, whether it's showing they're faithless, here's a couple of truths that we can pull out of this passage that are true either way. The first one is this, is that God is at work even when we can't see Him clearly. He's at work even when we can't see it clearly. I mean, think about what God does all throughout the book of Esther. We already talked about the fact that it was so improbable that Esther could have ever become queen. Only God could have orchestrated that. A young Jewish girl that, didn't have any ties. She didn't have some big family heritage or anything. She's not the likely one to get picked, and yet God orchestrated it so it happened. And as you continue to read in the book of Esther, you find that God continues to work out all these things so that His people can be saved, and so that He can carry out and fulfill the promises that He's made. So God's working behind the scene all this time, even when Esther can't see it, Mordecai can't see it, the Jewish people can't see it, but God is at work. He also had put Mordecai in just the right place. If you go back to chapter 2, you find that Mordecai, or chapter 3 I think it is, Mordecai had learned about a plot against the king, and he'd foiled the plot, and down the road God's going to use that to earn him favor with the king again. So God's working behind the scenes all through this entire process. As I said before, even though God's not mentioned at all in this book, this story that's told here is all about God working. Even though His name never appears, He's the hero of this story, not Esther, not Mordecai. And doesn't God still do that today? I mean, sometimes God is working even when we don't see Him. He's working even when we don't see those answers to our prayers, or when God doesn't answer them in the way that we think He should. He's working through the difficulties and the trials in our life, even when we can't see His hand at work. And sometimes God gives us a little glimpse into that, sometimes here in this life, but sometimes we never see it. We may never see it, but I can promise you, based on the Scriptures, that God is at work even when we can't see Him. That's why Jesus said this to His disciples in John chapter 5. He said, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." And that's still true. The Father is still working now. Jesus is still working now, whether you see Him or not. So God is at work, regardless of whether you can see Him. The second implication here is that God works through flawed people. It's what we've already seen this morning. God works through flawed people. I mean, even if Esther, even if Mordecai, even if they're faithful here, we see they're still flawed people. They hide who they are, and they hide their Jewishness there. But God still uses them. He uses them in a mighty way. And God still does the same thing today. Even though we're flawed people, God still uses us, and He wants to work in our life. I mean, think about it. All through the Bible, what does God do? He works through flawed people. Now, that's what I love about the Old Testament, about the Bible in general, is that it doesn't paint this rosy picture of all the heroes of the Bible. I mean, think about all the heroes of the Bible. People like Abraham and Moses. We already talked about David and Esther and Mordecai. God uses all of them, even though they're flawed people, and God can still use us. So we see this morning this idea that a flawless God often uses flawed people to accomplish His will. So what does that mean for me? I mean, what does this mean for me? What can I take away? What are the implications for my life this morning as we look at this passage together? I want to leave you with just one. There's so many I could come up with, but let me just leave you with one. And that's this. Here's what I want to encourage you with this morning. Don't let yesterday's sin keep me from serving Jesus today. Don't let yesterday's sin keep me from serving Jesus today. Dave, if you can go to the couple more slides forward there. There we go. I began this morning by talking about Carlos Whitaker and about what he went through and about how his sin cost him his ministry, how it almost cost him his family. You know what the encouraging news is? The encouraging news is that over a period of time, God helped him to work through that. He restored his marriage. And he's back in ministry, although it's in a completely different kind of ministry than he was in at the time. He's even written a book now called Kill the Spider that he wrote to try to help other people who have been through difficult sins in their life and who thought that their lives were all over and that their ministry for God was all over. Because God brought him through that, and He wanted to share it with some other people. And that was possible for Carlos, and it was possible for Esther and Mordecai, and it's possible for all of us because with Jesus, failure is never final unless we allow it to be. Failure is never final unless we choose to let it be final in our lives. See, Jesus, He died on the cross to pay the penalty for our sins. And as we sang about this morning, when He was resurrected, He resurrected us. But remember when we sang that song this morning? The resurrected King is resurrecting me. It's present tense. He's still doing His work in my life today. Not only did He bring me back from spiritual death, but day by day, He's taking those sins in my life. He's putting my life back together so that I can still serve Him. But He'll only do that if I allow Him to do that. We have to be able to do what Paul said in Romans chapter 6. And Jesus is the only one that makes this possible, to consider ourselves dead to sin, but alive to Jesus Christ. And as Carlos Whitaker would be the first to tell us, God restores, but when He restores, that doesn't mean that we always get back everything that we once had. Carlos would be the first to tell you that. His ministry today is completely different than it was before the sin and what he went through. And I got to believe his marriage is much different today too. I mean, you know, his wife probably doesn't trust him like she once did. And I'm glad that God's reconciled, but it doesn't mean that everything gets put back together. It doesn't mean that everything goes back to the way it once was. But here's the exciting part. God can still use us. He uses us in new and in different ways. Because failure with Jesus is not final unless we allow it to be. What we see here in Esther is that God can take a flawed person, even one who has failed repeatedly, and He can use that purpose to fulfill His flawless plan. So how do we make sure that we do that? How do we make sure that Jesus is able to to come into our lives and to repair that damage and to use us again. Let me suggest to you 4 steps that you can take to do that. I'm not going to ask you to do that right now because these are going to take some time. But if you're in that place in your life where maybe you've looked at your life and felt like God can't use you anymore, I'd encourage you to take these steps. Number 1, ask God to reveal any past sins that are keeping you from serving Him. Number 2, confess those sins to God. He's promised that He'd be faithful and just to forgive you from those sins and to cleanse you from your unrighteousness. Then ask God to help you do what it talks about in Romans chapter 6 and consider yourselves dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. And then finally, find some place you can go and serve God. It may very well be that that's going to be something completely different than what you ever did before. Probably will be. Because maybe whatever sin you got involved in, maybe it makes you unfit for the ministry you were in before. But that does not mean that God can't use you somewhere else. Whatever sin you may have committed in the past, it does not disqualify you from serving Jesus Christ in the present. If you'll allow Him, Jesus Christ is in the business of resurrecting dead people. And He'll do that for your life too if you'll just let Him. Let's pray.